Marriage and relationships, they're one of the few things that connect almost every culture. In every time period, after all, many would argue that the desire to find love and companionship is simply part of human nature. But while the drive to form relationships stays constant, the way society approaches them has always been evolving. Sometimes it's about compatibility. Other times, relationships are more like business deals. And if you take a look back at ancient Rome, you'll find that many of their attitudes and customs around marriage would seem downright unthinkable to us today. But interestingly, the Romans also had some surprisingly modern ideas mixed in with the old. Hey everyone, welcome back to Erosion. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of love and marriage in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, marriage wasn't about love, at least, not at first. Its main purpose was to transfer wealth and forge alliances between families by uniting two members in matrimony. Producing heirs was another key goal, both to continue the husband's family line and to help maintain the local population. Love, that was often an afterthought. In some cases, it wasn't even a factor. In Roman society, women had very few rights. They were seen primarily as vessels for marriage and childbirth. Legally, a woman wasn't considered a full person. She was more like property. And who controlled that property shifted throughout her life. As a child, she belonged to her father. Once married, she fell under the control of her husband, and this all happened early. Girls could be married off as young as 12, while boys might marry around 14. That said, most girls married in their late teens, while men typically waited until their mid to late 20s. And if you were from an upper-class family, the ages tended to skew even younger. Marriages were almost always arranged. A girl's father would negotiate with her future husband. She rarely had any say in the matter. Once an agreement was reached, the bride's family would provide a dowry. This was a collection of wealth. It could be money, land, slaves, valuables, that was handed over to the husband to help support his new wife. Early in the Roman Republic, many women entered a marriage called manus. Under this system, they were transferred fully from their father's legal control to their husbands, and within manus marriages, there were actually a few different types. The first was coemptio, which basically translates to purchase, and yes, it was exactly what it sounds like. The wife was essentially being bought by the husband, and move out was more business deal than love story. Then there was usus, a type of marriage based on cohabitation. If a couple lived together for a full year, the wife would automatically fall under her husband's control, unless she spent 3 consecutive nights away from the home. In that case, she could avoid falling under manus. Finally, there was conferiatio, a religious marriage ceremony complete with rituals and formal rites. Of the 3, this one looked the most like what we think of as a wedding today. Now, understandably, no woman wanted to enter something called a purchase or a usage marriage, because, well, yikes. Luckily, in the later years of the Republic, a new form of marriage gained popularity, sine manu. This version allowed the woman to stay legally under the control of her birth family, even after marriage. It gave her more freedom and the ability to manage her own finances and property, especially if her father passed away. In that case, instead of her husband inheriting everything, she could keep it herself. Roman weddings were deeply tied to religion. Everything, even the date of the wedding, was carefully chosen to win favor with the gods. Most Roman weddings were held in the month of June because of the goddess Juno. She was the goddess of women and marriage, and it was believed that her blessing would bring happiness to the couple. Avoiding bad omens on the wedding day was considered essential. A single unlucky sign could doom the entire marriage. Following traditional customs was also seen as a way to ensure prosperity and harmony in the union. In order for a couple to legally marry in ancient Rome, 3 conditions had to be met. Both people had to have the right to marry under Roman law. Both had to be of legal marrying age. All involved parties had to consent. Now, there's a catch here. In practice, the woman didn't really have a choice. Whether she liked the marriage or not, as long as she didn't publicly object, her silence was taken as consent. Before the ceremony, the bride-to-be had to make a special sacrifice to her household gods. This included giving up some of her childhood belongings, a symbolic way of marking her transition into married life. The wedding and reception were typically hosted at the bride's father's house, and he was responsible for covering all the costs, including a lavish feast. An ideal bride was expected to be excited, but also a little scared about her new life. After all, she was stepping into a completely different world, one where her husband would have full authority over her, and she was expected to fulfill her role as a dutiful wife. One particularly strange wedding custom in ancient Rome involved a staged kidnapping. Yes, really? The groom would pretend to kidnap his bride as part of the ceremony. Why? It was all about avoiding offending her household gods. If she left her father's home willingly, it might anger the gods she grew up honoring, but if she were taken, it wouldn't be seen as a betrayal, a bit of religious loophole work, if you will. After the ceremony, there would be a wedding procession to the groom's house. The front door would be smeared with oil and pig fat, a ritual meant to protect the bride, since she hadn't yet established ties with her new household gods. Upon arrival, she would be carried through the doorway, a symbolic gesture marking the official start of the marriage. After that, the guests would leave so the couple could spend their wedding night together. In Roman society, the roles within a marriage were clearly defined. The husband was responsible for providing for the family, whether that meant working in a trade, holding public office, or serving in the military. The wife, on the other hand, ran the household. That included everything from cooking and weaving to caring for children and honoring the family's household gods. So, while Roman marriages often began as practical arrangements or alliances, society placed high value on harmony and loyalty within the relationship. Ideally, love would develop over time. A good marriage was one where the couple supported each other emotionally and where their personalities complemented one another. Mutual devotion was considered the hallmark of a strong relationship, and how your marriage was perceived could directly affect your social standing. Roman writers loved to emphasize the image of the ideal wife, one who was modest, loyal, supportive, and obedient to her husband. Now, let's talk about fidelity. For women, it was non-negotiable. A wife was expected to be completely faithful to her husband, and infidelity on her part was considered adultery, a serious offense that could come with harsh consequences. Men, on the other hand, had a lot more leeway. For a man, the only time his extramarital relations were considered adultery was if he slept with another man's wife or daughter. Slaves and prostitutes didn't count, and here's another twist. Same-sex relationships were totally acceptable for men, as long as they played the dominant role. It was all about social status and power dynamics. Of course, we should remember that nearly all the surviving texts and records from ancient Rome were written by upperclassmen. That means we're seeing things through a pretty specific lens. It's very possible that everyday marriages, especially among the lower classes, were more balanced and affectionate than the historical record might suggest. It's easy to forget, but for people living at that time, arranged marriage was simply normal. Most had no concept of choosing their own spouse based on love or attraction. So while the whole system seems cold or controlling from our modern perspective, it was just the way things were back then. That said, the voices of the women, especially common women, are largely missing from the historical record. Their feelings, struggles, and triumphs have been lost to time. So while we can outline customs and expectations, we'll never truly know how they felt about their lives and marriages. Now let's get into divorce, because, surprisingly, the Romans were way ahead of their time here. Unlike many cultures that came later, the Romans had a fairly relaxed view of divorce. It wasn't seen as morally wrong or religiously forbidden. In fact, it was pretty normal, especially among the upper classes. Sure, people might gossip, but there wasn't much social stigma attached to ending a marriage. And forget the long court battles we deal with today. Roman divorces were usually handled privately between the two families. Just like the marriage itself, it was considered a family affair. At first, only men had the legal right to initiate divorce. Some of the documented reasons a man might leave his wife included adultery, drunkenness, or not being able to bear children. But as time went on, especially by the beginning of the classical period, women also gained the legal ability to divorce their husbands. Financial matters were the most complicated part of a Roman divorce. The husband would keep the children, since they were considered part of his family line. That was the whole point of the marriage in the first place, to produce heirs. So custody automatically went to the father. The mother might still be able to see them, but they wouldn't live together anymore. As for the dowry, it didn't all go back to the bride's family. The husband could actually keep part of it, especially if the couple had children. The more kids, the more of the dowry he kept. The rest would be returned to the bride's family. And when a marriage ended, so did the alliance between the two families. Any political or social benefits tied to that connection gone. For families in the upper classes, this could be a serious blow to their influence. But divorce wasn't the end of the line. In fact, people were encouraged to remarry, and many did. Marriage in ancient Rome wasn't just a personal relationship. It was a civic responsibility, keeping the population going, forming alliances, creating social stability. It was all part of the bigger picture. So once a marriage ended, starting another one was considered perfectly normal. In some ways, Roman views on marriage and divorce were surprisingly modern. They recognized that not every relationship worked out. They gave people the chance to start over. And while many aspects of their system seem rigid or unfair by today's standards, there's something very human at the core of it all. The desire to find connection, to build a life, and to adapt when things don't go as planned. So, if I ever found myself living in ancient Rome, one marriage would probably be enough for me, too. Beat. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into Roman marriage customs, don't forget to like the video and drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more deep dives into history like this, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more erosion content. But for now, I'll see you in the next one. Now, before we wrap things up, it's worth zooming out and looking at how Roman attitudes toward marriage evolved over time, and how those shifts tell us a lot about Roman society itself. At the very beginning of the Republic, marriage was tightly bound to ideas of ownership and control. Women were passed from their fathers to their husbands like pieces of property. The Manus marriage forms we talked about earlier reflected this. They were essentially legal transactions, with the bride's personal autonomy reduced to almost nothing. But as the Republic aged and transitioned into the Empire, social values started to change. More and more women, especially those from elite families, opted for sine manu marriages. This subtle shift allowed women to maintain greater legal independence and control over their finances. Now, this wasn't necessarily a sign of feminist awakening. Wealthy Roman men also saw advantages in keeping their wives tied to their birth families. It allowed for more flexible alliances and ensured that property stayed in certain circles. But the result was that women gained a little more room to maneuver in what had always been a male-dominated system. Religious beliefs remained deeply woven into marriage customs throughout Roman history. Appeasing the gods wasn't just a quaint tradition, it was a serious concern. Many Romans genuinely believed that divine favor or disfavor could make or break a marriage. That's why seemingly odd rituals, like smearing pig fat on the doorway or staging the mock kidnapping, carried so much weight. These were practical acts of spiritual negotiation. The Romans were trying to balance two worlds, the seen and the unseen. And even though love wasn't the main goal of a Roman marriage, there was always room for it to develop. Writers and poets from the time, like Ovid and Propertius, sometimes idealized romantic love within marriage, though this was more an aspiration than an expectation. Of course, all of this paints a picture that mostly reflects the experiences of the elite. What about ordinary Romans? Farmers, craftsmen, merchants? The truth is, we don't know nearly as much about their relationships. Most surviving records focus on the upper classes, who had more elaborate customs and political motivations tied to marriage. For the lower classes, marriage was likely simpler and more practical. Personal affection may have played a bigger role, since political alliances weren't at stake, and with fewer resources involved, things like dowries and formal ceremonies might have been less elaborate or skipped entirely. What we do know is that Roman society as a whole recognized marriage as a cornerstone of social stability. Whether you were patrician or plebeian, being part of a household, producing heirs, and maintaining order were seen as essential civic duties. Now, let's circle back to divorce for a moment, because the Roman model is genuinely fascinating. Unlike in many later societies where divorce was rare or forbidden, Romans saw it as a practical option. If a marriage wasn't working, especially if it failed to produce heirs, ending it was often considered the responsible thing to do. There were no elaborate legal battles or moral condemnations, and as we mentioned earlier, both men and women could initiate divorce, at least by the later periods of Roman history. But there were consequences. The loss of a family alliance could weaken political influence. Financial arrangements had to be untangled, and if children were involved, the legal presumption was always in favor of the father's control. Still, the fact that remarriage was encouraged shows how pragmatic Roman society could be. They valued the institution of marriage not as a one-time sacred bond, but as a repeatable civic function. It was meant to serve the greater good of society, and personal happiness, while welcome, was secondary. So, what can we take away from all this? Well, first, the Romans were far more complex and adaptable in their approach to relationships than we might assume. Their system was steeped in inequality and patriarchy, but it also contained surprising elements of flexibility. Second, many of the debates we still have today about marriage, romantic love versus practicality, gender roles, divorce rights were already playing out in different forms 2,000 years ago. And finally, understanding how ancient Romans approached marriage helps us appreciate just how much human relationships are shaped by culture, law, and belief systems. What seems natural or traditional to us today is almost always the product of long and shifting histories. If I had to live in ancient Rome, one marriage would probably be plenty for me. But hey, that's the fascinating thing about history. The more you learn about it, the more you realize how much it mirrors the world we live in now. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this exploration of love and marriage in ancient Rome, don't forget to give the video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want more deep dives into the past, make sure to subscribe to Erosion. We've got plenty more historical stories coming your way. Until next time, farewell.